Good evening, and thank you for staying for the discussion. We're actually going to have two discussions because the two directors of the movie are here with us. And so I'm going to bring them up first and have a conversation with them about the movie, and then we will have a second conversation with three guests, the ones that were announced in the program. And we're going to talk probably about everything else but what's in the movie. So the global food system, the global south, the smallholding farmers, and plenty of other things. But first, let me invite Melissa Robledo and Robert Kenner, the directors of Food Inc. 2. Please welcome them. Thank you, and the microphones are coming, excellent. So it's Food Inc. number 2, comes after a very successful first movie, 2008, it's a long time ago. What motivated you to come back to the topic after such a long time?
We thought we would never come back. We are filmmakers, we don't specialize in films about food. But when the pandemic hit, we were just shocked by the brutality of the system that was killing off workers, and it was just, it was really horrendous what was happening in the States and I think around the world.
Just the microphone closer to you.
Oh, okay, sorry. But we also thought when we made the first film that people really cared about their food and were showing much greater interest, and it was part of a big food movement that happened around the United States and Europe and around the world, and we thought things would change, but we realized we were up against very powerful corporations that knew how to co-opt lots of things that were happening in the books and the movies that were coming out, and we felt like we wanted to talk about that in this film.
And both films are about food, but they're really about capitalism, right? They're really about big corporations and the way capitalism works today, particularly in the US. You go to Sao Paulo and you have information about France and Italy, but mostly in the US. So how do you look at the broader issue surrounding capitalism beyond food? And how has this research kind of informed your thinking about that?
I think, on some levels, what's happened is that there are these multinational corporations, many of which are in Europe, that care about their bottom line, and they're going to do anything to keep creating these profits. And they're now turning out food that's making people sick and really killing their customers, but they need to keep making a profit. So on one hand, it's about the United States, but we've exported many things, and I think we'll be exporting this terrible system, and hopefully this film is a warning to others to avoid what's happening.
That's actually it was actually interesting because there was some laughter in the room when you were showing those absurd and grotesque, gigantic cheeseburgers and donuts with chicken wings. But the reality is those products are leaving the US and are going to the rest of the world, right?
Absolutely, they are. And it seems essential that we, at least in the United States, our hope is that the interest in antitrust enforcement that we're seeing around big tech, our hope is that we see that around big food also. And I think the corporations are concerned in the United States that there's pressure and they're looking to export their products anywhere they can to the farthest reaches of Brazil in some cases.
So when we last spoke, you told me something that blew me away because I never really thought of this way. You said, and I'm paraphrasing, but we expected reactions to the film, and actually one of the reactions you got was that the people running these companies consider themselves kind of heroes of the food system, not creators of problems, but heroes because they provide plenty cheap proteins to people. which of course is a complete reversal of the way we probably in this room look at this reality. Tell me a little bit more about this reaction you got.
This was in 2008. These companies thought they were, again, delivering calories at a cheaper price than at any time in history. And they thought they were doing God's work. All of a sudden, I think we've started to look at those calories and seeing the consequence of health, that it's really created a major health crisis. In Iowa, you can't swim in the streams. And when we showed in England, people would say, oh, it's not going to happen here. But the GMOs were being brought in, and the labor practices are happening in Europe now. And the people who own Bayer saw the film and said, we're so much better than Monsanto. Guess what? They bought Monsanto. So I think these things are going to slowly creep over to Europe as well. But I think that the food industry is now a little more cautious, more sophisticated in their response to people criticizing them, and they're obscuring the problems and trying to say, hey, we can deliver food with less sugar, less salt, but they can't deliver food that's not ultra-processed.
And now they're trying to say that ultra-processed foods aren't so bad. That's kind of the new response to it, that they're fine, really.
The new wave of ultra-processed foods, which have some interesting nature-related label, but the reality is the process to produce them is the same. But another thing that the film doesn't really say explicitly, but seems to point to is we tend to think that ultra-processed foods are very cheap, and therefore they are bought mostly by people who cannot afford better food. But when you look at the figures, 58% of the calories consumed in the US is ultra-processed. That means that even people who can afford other foods are buying them now.
Everybody's buying them. There's not one group that isn't. And we see that across the board. Yeah. That
was a big surprise from 2008, because we were talking about how these cheap foods were being targeted to lower income people could not afford healthier food. But now we realize that they're also targeting people with money to buy this food. The next generation is ready to go buy things that you can eat quickly.
Right, it's for convenience.
It's convenience, and it's kind of addictive. They're finding out, the more we learn about this food, what it's doing to our brains, and how we are just not able to stop eating it once you start it. And that's a frightening thing. So as it comes into your country, it will start to make it easier for people to keep wanting to eat it.
So at the end of the movie, you kind of suggest that technology is going to bring a big chunk of the solution, lab-grown meat and plant-based alternatives to meat proteins. And so how much faith do you really put into technology?
Well, we thought we were more ambiguous than that, because we don't have a lot of faith, and we've actually added a line or two that's not in this film that will be out in the next few weeks when we show the film, which is when Michael was eating that cell-based meat, it turned out it was not made from those reactors. They don't know how to make it, and
it's made using a very like a handmade process that's costs thousands of dollars. Like, it's not sustainable. It's nowhere close to what they're suggesting.
And the Impossible Burger is an ultra-processed product made with GMO soy. So ultimately, we think that there are other foods that people should be eating, and we're not implying that those are the solution. But we do need to eat less meat, and climate is a major problem.
Just maybe one last point, because you have planned what we here at the festival call an impact campaign around the film. So the film is a tool for the message that it contains, but also for doing other things. Tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about that. How do you plan to use the film for impact?
Well, one large portion of that, we have a screening coming up in Washington, D.C. that's aimed at policymakers, and really to go after, to enforce antitrust laws we have on the books. It's possible we should be breaking up large corporations, we should be blocking mergers, and that's kind of the widest policy impact. There's also school food and workers' rights.
But I think in Europe, we should have labeling on ultra-processed foods, and I think that would be a great impact campaign that should be started, and there should be recognition of the workers that are picking your products in Europe, and there should be things around that, and hopefully we can help organize that, and some people in this audience can help organize that.
So this audience actually is the first audience in Europe seeing this film, because it's been shown only at the Telluride Film Festival in the US. It's not out yet. It's coming out in 3 or 4 weeks.
Yes.
So
Yeah, we're opening in 100 and some odd theaters on April 9th around the United States, and then sort of on pay-per-view April 12th, and then hopefully that will propel Dogwoof, who's distributing in Europe, to set things up after that.
So good luck with the launch of the film, and thank you for coming to the festival. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.
And so we have 3 invitees for the further discussion. One is Rupa Mukherjee. She works for a Swiss NGO, Helvetas, the partner of tonight's screening. She has brought a science background. She has been one of the lead authors of the IPCC 5 and 6 reports, and also a policy background. She's been involved with the COP climate conferences. And at Helvetas, she runs a team that focuses on food systems and climate change in the Global South. So welcome, Rupa Mukherjee. And then from the Philippines, we have Luis Maburo, the founder of the Cacao Project. She works on sustainable and resilient livelihoods for family farmers. Welcome, Luis. Please. And then somewhere there up on the top right corner should appear our third invitee from the UK, Georges Monbiot, columnist for The Guardian, activist, writer. Last year he published a book that has a title, Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet, a title very similar to tonight's discussion. Let's see if we get George. George, how are you?
Yes, great, Bruno. Good to see you.
Excellent.
Nice to meet you, Rupa and Louise.
So, as I said before, we're going to talk mostly about things that have nothing to do or that were not in the film. But let's just kind of finish with the film by getting a couple of reactions from you here. Rupa, when you see a film like this, so exploited workers in Florida, exploited workers in meatpacking factories, overfilled supermarkets, what comes to mind from your position as a director of food systems and working in the Global South?
All of the topics that were covered in the film resonate fully with the things that I see daily in my work in the Global South. So, and also the topics that we deal with at a policy level in terms of being relevant for climate action. At the fundament of human well-being is the ability to have access to nutritious food in an affordable manner on a continuous basis, and right to a decent life. And I think both of these come together so much in the way that our food system operates. I could fully understand the exploitative working conditions that are prevalent in those farms, but have also been prevalent in our neighborhood. I mean, we remember the time of COVID when workers from Eastern Europe couldn't come into Europe, and there were crops that were going waste. There was no harvesting that was possible. And there are not enough local workers willing to do these tasks. So it is not at all unfamiliar. And it's the reality quite close to us as well.
Luis, your reaction?
I think it's incredible to see such a broad topic, food systems, so much aspects to it, so comprehensively put. And it's very familiar as a person on the farms and in the fields, but also oddly strange to see the scale of it at a higher level versus being in, say, an agroforest or a farm in the Philippines. Seeing that divide is just jarring.
George, you're going to talk about the big picture in a moment, but just to close on the film, the final part of your book somehow is similar to the final part of the film in that it tries to discuss possibilities for diversifying protein sources. Now, I know that you don't really believe in lab-grown meat and things like that, but in the book you tell the story of a European company that has another approach to substituting proteins. Tell us that story.
Yes, this approach is called precision fermentation, which is a refined form of brewing, and it's multiplying microbes to use them as a food source. In fact, there's quite a lot of startup companies now pursuing this approach, and some of them in commercial terms are ready to go, though they're facing regulatory barriers. Obviously, all novel foods need to be properly regulated, but sometimes they get regulated out of existence because livestock and existing industries lobby against their approval. And so we should try to avoid that. We should regulate everything on its merits. But it's a very promising approach because a lot of microbes are extremely nutritious and need very little in the way of resources in order to grow them. They can also be produced anywhere on Earth, anywhere with electricity. And so that could help some countries which are highly dependent on imports because they don't have sufficient fertile land and sufficient water to grow their own food, but without having to rely on bringing in their protein from elsewhere, they could become far more self-reliant, far more food sovereign than they can be at the moment.
So, George, let's just kind of expand the lens and look at the global food system. I remember you saying in a TED Talk, the worst thing we have ever done to the planet is farming. Explain that, because that seems pretty radical to me.
Yes, I know. It seems radical because while we're very happy to criticize every other industry, we tend to be very reluctant to criticize the environmental impacts of food production. Obviously, we need food, we need farming, and farming is a very, very old industry which is wrapped up in our cultural sensibilities, and so we're much more reluctant to criticize it. But unfortunately, farming is the greatest cause of habitat destruction, the greatest cause of deforestation, the greatest cause of wildlife loss, the greatest cause of species extinction, the greatest cause of land use, the greatest cause of freshwater use, one of the greatest causes of freshwater pollution, of air pollution, and of greenhouse gas emissions. So when you put all that together, it is the most damaging industry of all. And just one part of that, one aspect of it, which is livestock farming, which is massively and disproportionately damaging, probably has an impact comparable to that of the fossil fuel industry. And yet somehow we don't judge it by the same standards.
So, George, in the discussion, then I come back to Luis and Rupa. But in the previous discussion with the directors of the film, one of the points was how some leaders in the agri-food industry feel that they're kind of playing the hero role because they provide cheap calories in big quantities to a lot of people. It makes me think that somehow food is also sort of social contract. Isn't food supposed to be as cheap as possible somehow? Isn't that the kind of social contract we have constructed over the last 50, 60 years around food?
There is a real conflict here because food is too cheap for many farmers to farm well, but at the same time, it's too expensive for many people to eat well. And we have a gathering crisis now as levels of chronic malnutrition are rising again, having fallen pretty consistently from the 1960s to 2014. And then in 2015, the trend began to turn, and now it's accelerating to the extent that we've already lost a decade of progress. We're back more or less to where we were in about 2013 in terms of the levels of chronic malnutrition. This is a very dangerous situation. A lot of it is driven by the price of food. Food is too expensive for a lot of people. And good food is much more expensive. The standard estimate is that in order to eat a healthy, balanced diet, you need to spend 5 times as much money as you do in order to eat a diet that's merely adequate in terms of calories. So there's a conflict which is very hard to resolve. Now, I think there are some ways of dealing with it. We collectively around the world spend between $500 and $600 billion a year, $500 billion on farm subsidies. And a lot of those are completely wasted. They're just supporting the biggest farmers to do destructive things. They're not helping us. They're not helping us with the price of food. You could target some of those subsidies directly to reducing the cost of fruit and vegetables at the point of sale. And I worked out that for my country, the United Kingdom, if we were to halve the price of fruit and vegetables by subsidizing them at the point of sale, in other words, we're not reducing the price which farmers get at all, just reducing the price which consumers pay. And if that were to lead to a doubling in the consumption of fruit and vegetables, the cost would be £3 billion a year. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually really tiny when you consider the costs to the health service of people's diet-related diseases, and when you consider that it's no more than we're currently spending on farm subsidies, which do no one except for a relatively small number of farmers any good, and actually often keeps them in destructive industries which are going to collapse anyway. So I think we need a great rethinking of how public money is spent in the food system.
Luis, beyond that kind of distortion, there is another one that you told me about when we spoke, which kind of reframed my thinking significantly. You said, well, the global food system is actually not primarily functioning or aiming at feeding people. It's primarily structured around trade, around moving stuff around shipping stuff in and out of countries. And that's why we have countries that grow money crops to export, and then they have to import most of their food. Elaborate a bit that for us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that question, Bruno. So the truth is, the way our food systems are built right now, they're not built for a chef to cook them easier. They're not built for a farmer to grow them better. And they're not built for a consumer to eat more healthily. They're built on trade and supply chains. And that means long, carbon-heavy supply chains of shipping ingredients from one place to another. In the industry that I work in, which is cocoa, many farmers grow cocoa trees in vast monocultures and never, ever see the end product, which is chocolate. Meanwhile, on the other end of it, consumers will pick a chocolate bar off the shelf and never know that it comes from a bean off a tree that's been farmed by a farmer, that's been taken like 5 years to grow it. And so as a result, our supply chains are so vastly disconnected and they're so heavy, and they're never really optimized for local consumption, for the farmer's well-being, or for our personal well-being. And that's concerning because it means that as we're consuming, we're actually damaging the environment, we're not thinking of where ingredients are coming from, and it also detaches the idea that farming and food production is very much at its very base land stewardship. And so I think that's something that we've tackled in the film, but it's a very basic facet of food systems that needs to be addressed in the first place. And we saw that in the pandemic. Food systems were localized because we had no choice. So we know it's possible.
So because we're talking about trade, your specific sector, cocoa, has seen an explosion in prices lately. Even in Switzerland, chocolate is getting significantly more expensive. But that doesn't seem to bring more money to the farmers.
No, not at all. I mean, the price of cocoa is course, various factors of economics, but it's also dictated on Bloomberg. It's a website that farmers don't really know how to access in the first place. I had to tell my farmers, did you know that your cocoa prices, you'd see it on the website on Bloomberg and you'd know how much it costs. And then they had no clue, because usually it's dictated to them by traders. But on the other end of it, it's because of that distance of the supply chain, where it has to be shipped. So peace and security issues, shipping routes all impact the price of cocoa. And that has nothing to do with farmers and the production costs of growing it. So that's a big aspect of that.
In a moment, I'm going to make you tell us exactly how you work with farmers. But Rupa, you and your team work in more than 30 countries, if I remember correctly. Is there a geography of the food system? Meaning, are there regions where things function better, regions where they're really disastrous? What's the geography of the global food system?
I think in contexts where there is good governance and people can influence policies, I think food system transformation is possible. It happens, and activists and consumers have hope. So I've seen that happen in a couple of contexts where there were distorted subsidies, as we saw in the film, which was distorting what farmers were producing, what was coming in the market, what was affordable. But focused, I'm talking about the distortion between millets and rice being a very water-consuming crop, methane-emitting, and millets being much more nutritive, which can be grown in rain-fed areas. And it makes a lot of sense to grow the right crop in the right region, while it also provides local employment to women. And there was a distortion in the subsidy. Millets were not included in the government buying protocol. And this could be changed through advocacy from women farmers group, from consumers, from academics as well, research. So I think a level of good governance is important, and then food systems can be adopted to what is appropriate for the local context.
One of the arguments that are put forward to interconnect the food system even more and make it even more global is food security, right? Is the idea that interconnection and production specialization and so on contribute to global food security. Yet hundreds of millions of people are still underfed. There are food crises popping up here and there all the time. What's the right way, Rupa, to think about food security?
I think this conviction that a globalized food system is necessary to provide cheap food and assure food security has actually not worked. So there are 1 billion people today who are obese. There's a growing number of people who are food insecure, really severe food insecurity. So the proof that this approach hasn't worked is before us. We have this huge consolidated companies with supernormal profits. And in a sense, by shareholding, etc., many of us are also part of that system. So the system is catering to different interests, and when you have such concentrated power in a few actors, then it also vitiates everything else. It vitiates the media we consume, it vitiates the political landscape, the power that lobby groups have with senators, etc. So there are serious systemic problems, and this argument that is made needs to be seriously questioned with facts, data, and everything that is our lived experience, actually.
But how do what's the right thinking here? Is it regional food systems? Is it national food security strategies? How do we shift away from this and go in a direction that's actually the right one?
So I have a lot of sympathy and understanding with the concept of food sovereignty. Everybody must be able to decide what's the food that they wish to eat, where should it be produced, and farmers should have the right to decide what they wish to grow, not distorting their decisions with untargeted, negative, harmful subsidies, subsidizing the input, subsidizing, making water freely available, for example, distorting the whole system of production. And if these things are questioned, then I think we will all be wise enough to take the right decisions. And I think the decision-making has to come closer to us as consumers, as producers, as parents. So,
Citizen, yeah.
yeah.
George, I'm wondering about your thoughts on food security, but let me frame that in a slightly different way. Are we being naive here? Because essentially the film shows us a food system that's completely broken, full of exploitation at every level, from the soil to the workers and to the consumers, controlled by big agribusiness. And so the temptation is to say, well, to do things right, we need to not do the things that are described in the film. But at the same time, we have this tendency of romanticizing small farming and the cow out alone in the pasture and so on, which is not scalable. So how do you look at the question of food security on a global and national scale?
Thanks, Bruno. Well, that's a crucial question. So first of all, I agree with the film and with Louise and Rupert, in that wherever things can be localized, they should be localized. We should bring everything down to the nearest and the smallest scale that we can. Unfortunately, not everything can be localized. And very large numbers of the world's people are now totally dependent on food imports. There was a study in the journal Nature Food which showed that the minimum average distance over which people can be fed with staple crops, grain-fed people who are eating grain, is 2,200 kilometers. And large numbers of people are dependent for their survival on the US Midwest, the Canadian prairies, the Russian steppes, the Ukrainian Chernozem, the Brazilian interior, and that food then being shipped around the world. And that's because many of the places where people live do not have a sufficient agricultural hinterland. We tend to live in big cities, in concentrated places, and locally there is often simply not enough land, and certainly not enough fertile land, and often not enough water to grow the crops which the people in those cities and those regions require. And then this introduces a really difficult dilemma, because for the foreseeable future, we are going to be many people of the world continue to be dependent, however much we change the system, on imports, simply because of the mathematics of where people live and where food can be grown. However much we do all the things we want to do and should do, there's still going to be that problem. And when you have these very long trade distances, it's an open invitation to corporate concentration. And we have this disastrous situation here where 4 corporations control 90% of global grain trade. That doesn't mean that the problem is itself global grain trade. The problem is corporate power and concentration. But that's very dangerous for all sorts of reasons, some of which are explained in the film, but also the systemic instability of the global food system. It makes the global food system less resilient, just as the global financial system became less resilient leading up to 2008. One corporation going down could destroy the whole food system. It could cause cascading impacts, which pulls the whole thing down. And while the world's governments were able to rescue the financial system at the 11th hour by generating future money in the form of quantitative easing, you can't rescue the global food system by generating future food. It's a potentially very dangerous situation indeed. So we've got to find a way of recognizing that while large numbers of people, and probably increasing numbers of people, because we're seeing the shrinkage of what's called the human climate niche, of where food can be grown, and indeed in many cases where people can live, that's shrinking, that's going to make us more dependent on food trade. We need to find a way of breaking up those corporations, of making that trade much fairer, of making the production of those crops much more distributed, in order not just to bring justice back into the system, but also to make the system more resilient.
Luis, let's go local for a moment and talk about the farmer families you work with in the Philippines. A few hundred families for now, but so many farmers in the Philippines have been given land by the government over the last several years. But they've not been given training, they've not been given skills, they've not been given technology. So how do you work with them to bring those things?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Bruno. I mean, with the agrarian reform in the Philippines, it's from colonial periods and dividing land to make sure it's being given back to the farmers and the people who live there. However, it's also the struggle of giving it to people who don't have the resources or capacity to develop that land. So oftentimes it's either sold off to unsustainable development or it's just left barren. So with the Cacao Project and my initiative, we work with those farmers to maximize that land. It's usually just 1 to 2 hectares, not enough to mechanize, but enough to till or grow ingredients. So we help them maximize it. We provide them with months of training worth of input, how they can transform monocultures into agroforests, which provide more economic services, and understanding the value of that landscape. So it's not just, planting to grow food or planting for livelihood. It's planting to develop economic services like windbreakers, making sure that they have food for subsistence, making sure they have income or shade or just better quality soil to farm in the long term. So it's really practical. And I listen to a lot of these discussions and it's so high level that we forget that these are actually people and individual meals and people getting by every single day. So with these farmers, it's understanding their role as individuals in the larger, vast scale of the farming system, but also understanding that they play a very vital role in how we produce food. And with my initiative, it's creating a Frankenstein's monster of a food systems model of putting things together and providing inputs all the way from when we plant the seed in the ground and plant that farm to growing the trees and watching them create these agroforests and the tree cover stitching together, all the way to bringing that food onto your plate and making that accessible to farmers and easier to manage so people can kind of get an idea of what our food system looks like from bean to bar or from farm to table.
Indeed, one of the things that always strikes me when I think about smallholder farmers across the South is how invisible they are to us, right? They're literally present in our breakfast, in our lunch, in our dinner, but they're completely invisible to our thinking, to our reality. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, so when you walk down the shelf or like your grocery store and you pick an item off the shelf, you think of what the costs involve and you think of maybe shipping and labor and production, but you don't think of the individual faces of farmers. You don't think of the cost of the environment, of deforestation, of water sanitation, of health and nutrition. And that's something to do with food psychology and also labeling. So we've already talked a little bit about labeling of how do we bring those together, but also consumer consciousness. Number one is making sure that the immediate item that we see on the shelf is the cheaper, sustainable, better option for us, making the better option that's good for the environment easier to access. But it's also thinking of consumer consciousness, of thinking, where does this come from? And whether that's looking at the back of the label and thinking you have to be a bit more food savvy. Is this locally sourced? Is this coming from a farm that promotes exploitation? Or maybe I could think, I just want to make sure that I do not buy from specific companies or corporations that promote this unethical labor practice. So there's a lot of aspects to it of individual consumption, but also it's on the part of grocery stores, of companies to make sure that the option is more readily available. And that's thinking of how you incentivize them.
You mentioned before the whole chain related to cocoa. So you're trying to push or encourage or support to the farmers to actually get towards the final product. So essentially produce chocolate locally rather than export the cocoa beans.
Absolutely. So
and
it's making sure
how is that
farmers
working?
So with the cocoa industry, I mentioned that it's shipped. So from places like the Philippines, it's shipped to Switzerland. In our case, it's bringing all of that production value onto a farm. So the farm that those cocoa beans are grown from are also processed there. They're made into chocolate bars. It's easier on shipping. If you think about it, it's already compacting all those beans into bars. But it's also making sure that the end product is accessible to their farmers. They can choose where it goes to market. They have more financial autonomy and ability to dictate, hang on, I want to sell this locally. I want to sell it at this price. I want my community members to have access to this resource. And it's also making sure that they have autonomy to think and decide at what point in the value chain they want to sell. So they're not fully dependent on traders. They're not at the behest of policymakers and government. They have the financial autonomy and the freedom to decide at what point they can sell and make those decisions for themselves instead of it being told or handed to them.
Rupa, George before mentioned the distance between people living in cities and the places where food is produced. And one of the things that's happening now, one of the big trends is there is a sort of urbanization of food poverty, right? Especially across the global south. People are moving to cities in vast numbers. More than half of the global population lives in city today, and that trend keeps going. And the result is that food poverty is no longer only a rural phenomenon. It's actually less of a rural phenomenon, except for the very poor farmers. It's becoming an urban phenomenon. What kind of implications does that have? And how do you and your team work on that?
So I observed this about 20 years ago working in the slums in India, and I was shocked to see how many obese people there were in the slum, and I wondered what's going on here. And I realized that people have to buy food because there's no time. The women start working really, really early in the morning. So there's a lot of bought food, and because of affordability reasons, it's the worst quality of food. And now the data supports that fully, the extent of type 2 diabetes in the urban slums is among the highest. And what we do, and very interesting initiatives, is work with municipalities, because the municipalities are really concerned. It is their domain of work. They're concerned about public health. They're concerned about the health costs, etc. So we have a partnership with municipalities in secondary cities, because the big cities generally have a lot of money and visibility and awareness, etc. So we have a partnership with the secondary city, for example, in Bangladesh, in Tanzania, and we are working together with the city of Zurich to learn from each other, because the knowledge flows both ways. And we work with all the stakeholders in the city. So we are working with schools to get good food into the schools. We are working with the food vendors, because people will buy food. They don't have time to cook. But to see that it's produced using right ingredients, produced in a hygienic way. We are working with slum dwellers, really, to see how we can optimize the little bit of land that they might have and do a bit of vegetable cultivation, etc. And they're super good because they're the first generation urban residents. They have been farmers before, So they have that knowledge, they have that interest. They don't have access to seeds, they don't have access to information, etc. So we just make the links possible. And Helvetas plays this facilitating role. So we don't do things ourselves, because then what we do is limited by our own capacity, but rather work with the others. And I find this really, really also inspiring.
Is it by chance that you started working in the city of Zurich, or was it a choice? Is that a call to the city of Geneva to do something similar?
Yes, we would love to partner with many more cities. No, we worked at the city of Zurich for about 2 years, kept talking to the people, and they have some resources to invest, so said, let's do it in meaningful ways. It's a genuine partnership. So we work with their technical teams. Last week, we had the mayors of these cities here. They met with the mayor of Zurich, with the technical team that deals with food issues in Zurich, and they're really talking and learning and, benefiting from each other's knowledge. And we would love to do that with Geneva, with Lausanne, with anybody who's willing.
Okay, that's an open call. George, one thing you have listed in your list at the beginning of impacts of farming, and the film doesn't really touch upon, is water, which is a gigantic issue and is becoming really, really tough and urgent. So tell us a little bit about your reading concerning water.
So in 2017, there was a paper published saying there's all these projections about how much food we might need and how we need to raise yields in some parts of the world in order to meet that food demand. But how much water would that require? And the paper estimated it would require an extra 146% of water. So we have to have 1.5 times more water than we currently have, that we're currently using on Earth today. And yet water supplies in many parts of the world, in fact most parts of the world, are already maxed out or very close to maxed out. The most dangerous flashpoint, I think, is the Indus Valley. where you have the catchment shared by 3 nuclear powers. The Indus and its tributaries cross many highly unstable regions where people are very poor. There's a lot of hunger. And there's an Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan, which says this is how we're going to divide the water. But there's nothing in that treaty about what happens when that water starts running out. And at the moment, and for the past few decades, there's been extra flow in the Indus because of the melting of glaciers in the Hindu Kush and Himalayas. But of course, that can't last forever. And soon that meltwater is going to peak and start going into decline. And yet at the same time, there's this great drive by both India and Pakistan to be using more water, more irrigation of crops, more industries, more domestic use of water, although the great majority of water that we use goes in farming. One estimate suggests it's 90% of all the water. But in any case, it's clearly unsustainable. It can't possibly last. And some analysts say that the fighting in Kashmir is a kind of proxy battle over water resources. And it's like almost a dry run, so to speak, for much greater conflicts which could follow in the next few years and decades. But we're seeing similar situations around the world. And the real fear now is that many crucial water resources are running dry. They're running out. A lot of rivers aren't reaching the sea anymore. A lot of aquifers, groundwater is being depleted. But also we're now seeing this horrendous phenomenon of flash droughts. And that's when the soil moisture very quickly evaporates and disappears. So what happens is you get more heating, and that means that the rate of evaporation and transpiration increase. So soil moisture is depleted. The drier circumstances create more local heating. That then accelerates the evaporation and transpiration. You get a vicious circle, and very, very quickly a region can dry out. And that's happening increasingly now with climate breakdown. And it's one of the reasons why the human climate niche is shrinking. So we've got this escalating demand for water and this shrinking supply of water. This cannot end well. We have radically to change our approach to using the world's water. And it's not just a question of using it more efficiently, because if you just use it more efficiently, you can actually increase water use. There's this thing called the irrigation efficiency paradox, which means that, you know, if you switch to drip-fed irrigation and the rest, you make water cheaper for farmers to use, and so then they expand the area that they use irrigation on, or they switch to thirstier crops, which are often more lucrative. So you have to have regulation as well. You have to have policy saying we're going to limit the amount of water that can be used overall, limit the amount of water that each farmer can use, and switch to a less water-dependent farming with less water-dependent crops. It's not easy. It really isn't, but it's a lot easier than living in a world where the water's running out.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a couple of minutes and see if there are questions, but I want to run a couple of additional questions through you. George and maybe Rupa, your view on the farmers' protests of the last 6 months across Europe. Reaction to that? George first, maybe, and then Rupa.
Sure. So there are some entirely justified reasons for protesting. The shockingly low share of profits that farmers receive. Very often the processors and the supermarkets are taking an excessive amount of money. At the same time, farmers are finding themselves cut out of many aspects of the food chain. These are entirely valid reasons to protest, but unfortunately they're not the main focus of farmers' protests in Europe at the moment. The main focus is environmental measures, and farmers are pushing against attempts to limit nitrate releases, attempts to limit greenhouse gas emissions, attempts to limit pesticides. And sadly, European governments and the European Commission are simply rolling over and saying, all right, we'll scrap all that. Now, we can't afford to do that. You know, we're in an ecological crisis, an ecological emergency, a climate emergency. We urgently need to address our environmental impacts, and the sector with the biggest environmental impact is food production. So we have to address that. We can't say, oh, we'll just forget about that sector. But the first sign of a farmer's protest, governments just seem to give up, say, all right, we won't do that. You know, as environmental protesters, we go out on the streets, we get arrested and thrown into prison. The farmers turn up in their tractors, they dump loads of manure, they spray it over government buildings, they set fire to things, they drive at the police. They don't get arrested. There's massive double standards here in Europe.
Rupa, on the same question, there has been farmers' protests in recent years in India, for example. So how do you read the farmers' protest movement there and here?
So the ones who really produce food are not these big companies and feed the world that you mentioned, but the farmers. And I've worked in India on the power sector reform, for example, on the water-related issues. And reforms have to be done, right? There is a time when things are breaking apart. They're falling apart. Institutions like the power sector reform I was involved in, the energy company was not viable. It was taking too much of public funds to run it. So we have to change. And these are difficult decisions. They need matured adult conversations. And I think what is often lacking is a leadership that is able to present issues in their complexity and not dumping it down. So many of the leaders of these farmer-oriented groups have never been farmers themselves. They come from the richest families, but they speak for the farmers. So I think they're being strongly instrumentalized for topics that are ultimately very damaging to farming. And I think this is the same. I see parallels all the time between what's happening here and what I have experienced and lived through.
Luis, you're looking at all this from the Philippines, but do you have any thought about farmers' protests and so on? I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So much to unpack if you think about it. It's a very nuanced and intersectional conversation that I think we're not looking at the intersections well enough. In the Philippines, you know, it's so hard to tell farmers to talk about policy or environmentalism because you can't talk about climate change to people living on daily subsistence or people with a hungry stomach. People are hungry, they're gonna be angry. But on the other hand, it's also talking to farmers in a way they understand, translating climate impacts, environmental impacts, policy. Having that data translation really matters and is so critical, especially to a farmer who can't fathom where these ingredients are coming from or how climate matters to how we farm. So with our farmers, it's talking about the economic benefits of farming well. In the world right now, we need 70% more food by 2050, i.e. we need to produce more food, which is a catch-22 because the FAO predicts that we have less than 60 years worth of harvest left. So we're seeing less harvests, but also more demand for food. And in our opinion, in the Global South at least, the solution to that is regenerative farming. Instead of looking super far into the future of techno fixes, you might be able to find the solution by reaching back, looking at how we can be more in harmony with nature and restoring our food systems through soil stewardship, through farming in a way that is kind of conscious of the biological aspect of it, whether it's being conscious of, what's the word for it, pollinators, of how we use our insecticides. And many of our farmers and those solutions have existed in our cultures for years before the intervention of large corporations or food lobbies. And it's really bringing that back into the modern day and trying to meld that with scientific know-how today and addressing that.
Okay, let's get the light up and see if there are questions in the room. And I'm told that Ana Maria Suarez Franco, the UN representatives of the global NGO FIAN International, which advocates for the right to food and the rights of peasant movements, is in the room there. And so maybe we're going to start with you if you have a comment or a question. It should be on. Don't just talk into it.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you very much also for the opportunity to speak. I think this movie is very important to show the criticism to the agro-industrial food systems, which are not the only food systems that exist. There are also peasant food systems, indigenous food systems, and many special rapporteurs of the UN, including that on the right to food, on healthy environment, on health, have criticized the industrial food system, but we need more works like this to show why in this evident manner. And I want to recall that the other food systems do not only consider food as a commodity, which was very criticized here, but also go into the cultural, social, spiritual elements of food, which may not be present in the laboratories that will produce these proteins, that will also be done probably by corporations. I also wanted to highlight that peasants, they are called peasants and not farmers because they have a different way of life, from La Villa Campesina, which is the biggest peasants organization in the world, saw this problem coming. This kind of colonialism of the agro-industrial food system, and they proposed a human rights declaration on the rights of peasants that proposed some solutions, like, for example, the need of a transition to agroecology as a model not only to produce organically, but to change power relations, including the power relations of the big corporations. So it would be very interesting to connect this movie with what the movement of peasants is producing. The farmers' movement is not homogeneous. You have those who oppose to the transition, but you have also many others, especially in the global south, but also in the global north, proposing other kinds of changes. And of course, changes need time and need social transformation, and to this movie can help. I would just like to end saying that even if we say that ultra-processed food is cheaper, in fact, it isn't. The price is less, but the movie shows very well that the cost for the people and for the environment is high. So big element that we will use also in our advocacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Louise to react to this because she's also a chef. And you said food is also cultural. The first line of the movie is actually food is a set of relationships. So Louise, how does the chef look at all this?
I mean, I look at this and I think of just how broad food systems are, but also the fact that we approach it from such a technical point of view. We think of the data, you think of ultra-processed grocery stores, corporations, but also as a consumer or someone who eats food or cooks them, we don't perceive it this way. We don't think of these huge issues. And when you talk about the peasant movement and what we grow, I don't think was covered in the movie, and I'm sure it was brushed upon briefly, is that we don't diversify how we eat. Of all of the flora and species of food that we can possibly grow on this planet, we only grow about a fraction. And we oftentimes choose things that are very extractive, that deplete our soil, that deplete our nitrogen. But in communities like mine, we have all sorts of native, indigenous ingredients and food that have been grown there that restore our soils. And I think it's a very big part of incentivizing the diversification of our diets, to be more regional, to be more considerate of the nutrition that we were meant to grow up with. Climate change is changing that. When my town was hit by typhoons, we lost a lot of the ingredients that would normally be harvested at a certain time to provide me with the right nutrition that I needed. And because I was eating locally, I was experiencing vitamin deficiencies. And so I was dependent on all sorts of supplements. So the way we grow and the way we extract, and the fact that we're not eating as diversely as we could, is impacting our food systems just as much, because we could be more restorative in our diets. In fact, what if the food that we ate was actually good for the environment? What if the way we shipped and the way we brought things onto the table or ate seasonally or purchased locally wasn't just extracting, but also bringing back to those communities, putting back more carbon in the soil than we take from it? And I think we just don't consider that, because we've been kind of conditioned to take whatever is on our plates or whatever the normal food is. And we've started eating diets aspirationally, and it's called aspirational eating. We eat what we think is cool or what is better or what is trendy. And as a role of a chef, it's my job to make sure that we diversify what's on our plates or dictate what is cool, what we see on social media, how we're eating, and make sure that that's local, that's better for the planet. In the Philippines, it was kind of like the trend of using locally grown sweet potatoes that were endemic to the environment, that were restorative, or using microgreens and herbs that people have never heard of, but were actually just weeds that were not invasive. And so it's kind of like, as a chef, I'm thinking, what if we change the way we were eating as in restaurants and make the better thing, the cooler, trendy thing that young people would want to consume?
Other questions? Otherwise, I still have a couple. Just raise your hand. There is somebody there in the back? I can't see. Please stand up so you can see you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question because I feel that there is kind of a paradox. In one hand, people are living more and more in cities, which implies those obvious inputs problems you talked about. But in the other hand, in actual development plans, we also try to densify those same cities to avoid the loss of natural habitats that could happen in the countryside because of urbanization. How could we solve this paradox?
George, I suspect that's for you. Could you hear the question well?
Yeah, I could. Thank you very much. Yes. So we should be trying to avoid urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is bad for cities and bad for the countryside. It's very hard to run a city effectively if it's very spread out. It also means you're taking up a lot of agricultural land or a lot of wildlife land, which gets covered in concrete and asphalt and the rest of it. However, we should remember that urban sprawl is still relatively small as a problem by comparison to other land uses. All the world's built on area. So all the cities, all the towns, all the villages, all the roads, all the airports, all the rest of it adds up to 1% of the planet's surface. It's too much. It should be about 0.7%. We could live in a more compact way without this sprawl, without overdevelopment. The world's farmland is 38%. And a lot of that land is actually producing very little food, primarily grazing land. And that's called agricultural sprawl, when you have a lot of land to produce very little food. And if we're going to support habitats and prevent the collapse of Earth systems, in fact, if we're going to restore habitats, the first thing we should be looking at is agricultural sprawl, because that's by far the biggest component of the problem. And that means, above all, switching towards a plant-based diet. There is no good way of feeding all the world's people on animal products. Unfortunately, there's no way out of that. We all know how horrific intensive animal farming is. But in ecological terms, the only thing worse than intensive animal farming is extensive animal farming, which means using more land to produce a given amount of animal products. And all that land has an ecological opportunity cost, which is the wildlife habitat which would otherwise be there, and a carbon opportunity cost, because those wild habitats are invariably richer in carbon than the agricultural systems with which they are replaced. So this is why I'm keen on technologies like precision fermentation, because you can massively shrink the footprint, the land footprint, the water footprint, the nutrient footprint, the rest of it, in producing high protein foods. If we were to invent animal farming today, people would be absolutely horrified by the proposal. They'd think it was the most disgusting thing they'd ever come across. But people now are saying, oh, growing microbes, that's horrendous. Actually, it's much less horrendous in environmental terms, in welfare terms, in terms of the massive amounts of excrement, all the rest of it. It's much less horrendous than producing animals, which is what we're doing at the moment. So if you want to avoid sprawl, the best thing to do is to switch towards a plant-based diet.
I'm tempted to end on that, but let's see if there is one last question. Otherwise, we are going to end on that. Yes, here.
I don't think we can talk about consolidation within our food systems without talking about seeds, because 4 companies own half of our seed markets.
Seed trade, yes.
Yes, and also those companies are also agrochemical markets, so there are clear incentives there. So how do we fight this privatization of life when institutions like WIPO, which exists here, through UPOV convention, is pushing these on global majority countries, also with free trade agreements with WTO.
Rupa, I'm giving you the last word here on that question. Some of those companies, by the way, are based in Geneva.
Yes, indeed. I think this is a great imperative, also from a climate perspective. You know, this is the argument we are making continually, that the ability to choose and the science to decide what crops to sow, what to do if there is a drought, how to shift, what alternative exists for a shorter growing period, etc., have to be really close to the farmers. And they cannot be centralized in global companies that are so far removed from the needs of the farmers. This needs to change, but the allies are national governments, and this unequal power often means in multiple countries. We have seen how they've changed the laws, how they've influenced regulation in settings that have been where specific crops have been endemic, you know, where they originate from. There also GMO has come in, and very, very quickly, the market is taken over. We are losing all our crop biodiversity, which is the greatest adaptive resource that we will need for the future. So this is extremely alarming, but once again, this consolidation, concentration, makes it very challenging to move the system. Science tells us very clearly that we need diverse agricultural systems that are adaptable, the knowledge, the ability to shift closer to the ground, but the reality is very far from that.
You wanted to add something?
Well, not quite on the question. I think it's broadly on everything that we've discussed, is that I think we're not nearly thinking ambitiously enough in food systems. I mean, we think of agriculture and development as one thing or the other, or we think of, you know, it's whether we have more agricultural space or more cities. But what if we could redefine the idea of development? In my town, in my work, what I would hope to create someday is an agropolis, where we no longer think of farmers as a certain way, but it's just integrated as farming is land stewardship, or our diets are the way they're meant to be because it's what we are meant to grow in our regions and what we're meant to grow in the season. And that's easier and more accessible and cheaper and convenient because we've become a society of convenience. And think maybe what is good agriculture? It doesn't have to be a monoculture, it could be an agroforest. And you built a whole city around an agroforest. Development doesn't have to be new buildings or more supermarkets. It could just be more green spaces that do provide food. Vegetable gardens that are entirely edible, get rid of the ideas of lawns and make it into edible architecture, if you think about it. So I think that's a very big issue, is that we don't really think ambitiously outside of food systems. And we have such utopian ideas, but we never think of that in the way we consume and the way we lived our normal lives.
Can we put food at the center of reinventing the way we live? That's a beautiful way to end. So thank you, Rupa. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, George. Thank you, Robert and Melissa. And thank you all for being here tonight. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks.